streaming. I'm not supposed to be here. Can you help me get back?
Why? Earth is boring.
You're missing out on the joys of life, like pizza.
Hi, Muting. I just thought of one thing. If you have to leave early, I think you have to assign one of us as a host. Co-host is not enough. When you're ready to leave, please do that.
Yeah, so when I leave, I will assign Elizabeth as the host.
Okay, yeah, let me continue. Okay, thank you. Oh, it's 10 o'clock. Should we start? Okay, so we'll start. Good morning. Welcome to our first inaugural book club discussion. Elizabeth, are you going to share your screen? So I'm Lily Birmingham, the director of San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. So our book discussion today is Three Coins by author Russell Lowe. And with such great honor, he is with us today and he will give us a short presentation. Then we'll open the floor for discussion. But I also want to show you, Elizabeth, so our subsequent books are listed on the screen. Future discussion will be May and September. I hope you will continue joining us. And this is different from our lectures. This is more of discussion with you. So we want to share the the rules or protocols with you. Next.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm going to share. I work with the museum as a grant writer, and I will be helping to facilitate today's discussion. Probably most of you have participated in meetings via Zoom, but it's always helpful to go through the guidelines beforehand as a kind of reminder. Now, one of the things to mention, so right after this slide, and before the meeting starts, we're going to take a group picture. We will announce this. When we take the group picture, we're going to ask everyone to turn their camera on. After we take the group photo, Russell is going to give us a presentation a little bit about the making of the book. At that point, it would be great if you could turn your microphone and your cameras off. Now, please note, this book club meeting will be recorded. Okay, and probably the most important part, after the presentation, that's when the discussion starts. In order to have sort of keep the discussion orderly, we're going to ask that you raise your Zoom hand, or the little blue hand, to ask to participate, or write in the chat box. And I will help facilitate everyone's participation, calling on you when it's your turn. With that, I'm going to stop screen share so that Russell may present. Welcome, everyone.
Yes, with great honor, Russell is here with us the second time, talk about the making of 3 coins. So, Russell, you can introduce you're now a great author because he just got a agreement of a second book. So it's a great time for you.
My
Congratulations.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yes.
I would like to thank all of you for joining. It's my absolute pleasure to be surrounded by so many friends and families of 3 coins. Now, 3 coins was a journey, and I'm going to describe to you a little bit about how this story came to be known because, quite frankly, as you'll learn, the story of 3 coins is not one that my family knew. It was one that was uncovered through research. 3 coins, as I like to say, is a story that's really steeped in adventure, intrigue, and love. It's a love story. It's a story of forbidden love between these 2, a Ying on the left and Lai Hua on the right. These are my great-grandparents, and it is absolutely a true story, and a story of how my family and many families in America at that time came to be in this country. Now, the beginning of the story goes back at least 38 years. In 1982, my son Ryan was born. And according to my wife, and she's always right, I wanted to make him a family treat, so to let him know where he was from, but I found very quickly that I couldn't take it back too far. I knew parents and grandparents, but that was really about it. But as I began to dig around, I found all these wonderful photographs from the early 1900s, and I wanted to find the stories behind these photographs, to find the names, but not only the names, but the stories of who they were and how they lived. So as I made Ryan and then my son Rob the family trees, it started out fairly basically. I could see my parents there at the top, Lauren and Rose, but I needed to go back further. And over the next 15 or 20 years, I was able to really include many, many more names, hundreds of names that now allow them to take their genetic information back for really a couple centuries. So now this shows migration. It's the migration of genetic material. So the genetic material for Ryan and Rob came over from China, and actually Polynesia at one time, we thought, starting as early as 1865 and as late as 1914. And from Europe, that genetic material, those genes came over from many different places, Greece and Germany and Scotland, from 1840, 1752, 1914, and 1921. So those 2 sons of mine represent a lot of history in terms of the migration of material throughout the world. Now, as an overview of this lecture, we'll look at my philosophy, which is the importance of turning over stones, solving puzzles. We'll talk about the tools you have. Research involves oral history. And then we're going to discuss the importance of digitizing every single old photograph you can find from each relative. We're going to establish a historical context. We need to find a story, find a voice. And then I'll talk a little bit about the writing, the editing, and the publishing of a book or a story. Now, it's important that you look at the resources you have. And the resources you have will include, obviously, oral history, but also all of those family photographic records, family video records are really, really critical. National Archives, the Cameron House, if you have ancestors who stayed there, The census records, Ancestry.com, and DNA analysis can also be very useful. And then finally, as you'll see, newspapers.com was very instrumental in uncovering this story. You also have online photographic archives that can show you historical records so you can recreate the life and the world they lived in. And then finally, if you make it to China and you can find the family book, the Jiapu, you have a golden treasure of names and perhaps some dates that are really quite relevant. Persistence is the key. That's the attitude. And I'm not talking about persistence over a year or two, but persistence over decades. My journey, as you saw, began in 1982. As you'll discover, clues are scattered, their sporadic dead ends are common. Roadblocks may seem unmovable until another clue opens a door and turns on a light. I'll show you one example here. I thought I knew everything about my father. My dad, Lauren, was a World War II veteran, a hero. He came home with a Silver Star. We thought we knew everything about him. He loved to talk about it. And it seemed like he never bothered to write home. Well, it turns out that wasn't true, because a few years ago, my wonderful cousin Candace Tom took the trouble to send me not only these photographs of my dad, which I had never seen. The one on the left, he's actually writing the letter home, but she sent me this stack of 80-year-old letters from World War II that my dad had written to his mother, a very good son, a loving son, and it showed a side to my dad, Lauren, that we had never known. These letters figure prominently in a second novel, which is about to come out. In the research, it's important that you collect oral history, and I began this in 1991, where I began to visit every single relative. I recorded their stories, I copied all of their photographs, and many, many different people opened up their stories and their family albums for me, all of my cousins, my aunts and uncles, and they were wonderfully generous. In 1991, I sat down at a family event and I videotaped my dad and 3 of his siblings. They're talking about their life growing up in Salem, Oregon in the early 1900s. And they were sitting around a photo album, and the 3 of them or 4 of them had never done this before. And we're going to see in that the tall one there, Elsie, the little girl in front, Isabel. They're going to be in the videotape. My dad, Lauren, is the little boy on the right, and Leslie, who's not yet born, is the 4th sibling who's talking about this story.
I was sitting on Father's lap when, in 1918. And I can't remember too much about him because he died when I was only 7.5, but I remember him kind of round in the middle, and he was a gentleman. He was easy to get along with, and very good businessman.
Didn't Mother have to tie his shoes?
Yeah, he couldn't tie his own shoes. He couldn't bend over to tie them, so the family had to help him there a little bit.
Every night when he came home,
we used to get $1 when
take his shoes off, take his necktie, take his hat, take off his coat, take his vest, and you all got 25 cents for it.
I remember those things.
I do.
I remember the 25 cents.
He used to give us $1 when we would kiss his big toe.
That videotape goes on for about an hour, and they talk about things that they never would have talked about, and we recorded it forever for posterity. And what's remarkable is that all of their memories, their voices, their mannerisms, their laughter, it's saved, and at this point they're all gone, but we have that videotape to share with you and really with the world. And this family really becomes the subject of another novel I'll talk about a little bit later. As I was going through this, I faced the daunting task of collecting 100 years of family photographs, and these go back to the early 1900s. Someone had a camera, and they took this picture in 1918. This is my grandfather. They called him Hop Lee. He's Lo Sun Fook. He's the one who marries little Kay of the Hong family in 1903. The little boy is my dad. Isabel is here, and the brother Albert. This is a wonderful photograph. It's taken about 1908 perhaps, and it's the only copy I found of this. It was buried deeply in my grandmother's album that nobody wanted for some reason, but I found this rare treasure, and it shows her first 2 children, is Elsie, Ella, and little Bill. They're the first boy in about 1908. So one of the tips I have for you is go through the old cardboard boxes, look through everything no one else wanted, because sometimes the things that are important to your ancestors are not the big fancy gowns, but they're in the old cardboard boxes. My dad became an avid bicyclist later in his life, but I like to say that this was probably his first set of wheels in Salem, Oregon. Now, as I was collecting these photographs, I did something, not even thinking about it. I just started uploading all the photographs I could find to Google Photos. And what Google Photos did was it takes the faces and it looks at all the faces. And I not only uploaded family photographs, I also uploaded historical photographs, and it didn't know that. So it compares everything. And what it did through facial recognition was really quite remarkable, because it said, all right, I see your 1903 Hong family photograph, but I see other ones where people look very similar. In fact, it said he thinks that it looks just like, Google Photos thinks it looks like that boy there on the upper left. And it turns out this photograph is not a family photograph. It's a photograph taken by Isaiah Tabor of the Chinese primary school in San Francisco in the 1890s or 1900. And we know that Uncle Kim, the boy on the far right, actually did attend this school along with his friend Wei Jin, also in the book, and he's the boy sitting right next to him. But I never would have figured this out had it not been for Google Photos. This is a later photograph that also helped me to identify as Uncle Kim. This photograph on the right is one from the cover of the book. It's called The Christian Stairway. It was taken by Thomas Houseworth in 1880s. And it also, Google Photos said, well, there's another photograph you uploaded where it looks like the same girl. And this one we know is Ayin. Ayin is important because her daughter became the very first Chinese-American. Actually, that was a different one. But Ayin is a character in the book, and it's a character that's also important. But it's Google Photos which allowed me to identify her in this photograph, as well as little Chun Fa here. Little Chun Fa is also important because her husband, Ying Poon Chu, became one of the important Chinese-American activists and the publisher of the very first Chinese language paper outside of China. But it was Google Photos and facial recognition which allowed me to see that. Now, more recently, it suggested that this other person, another family relative, may be the girl sitting on the front there on the right. We'll have to figure that out. Now, as I proceeded further with this research, I wanted to talk to the Hong family. This is the direct descendants of Ying and Lai Wall, but I didn't know any of them. So I contacted somebody I knew about, and that person I knew about from my dad was dear Aunt Arabella Hong. Arabella, as you now know, was the performer in the Flower Drum Song in 1958. I grew up hearing her beautiful song, Love Look Away, and I called her. And I called her in 2002, and she was so kind and gracious. She invited me to the family home in Cerritos on August 26, 2002, and at that meeting, she showed me the photograph there in the middle. You can see it's faded. This is the original picture I took of it, and it basically opened a door to a new world, because on the back there was a date, 1903, and a series of names and the people. And I said, who are these people? And she said, well, those are your great-grandparents, and that's your grandmother and her siblings. I obviously since have improved the photograph dramatically. It's gone around the world. This is one of the iconic photographs of not only this family, but of the early Chinese in San Francisco at the turn of the century. Now, at that same visit, I went with my cousin to cousin Lisa, who's Arabella's daughter, to the National Archives. And we found a bunch of things, including this census record of the family in 1900. This is that same family. You can see the names. We have a date, and we had an address. So we have a light bulb here going on, because now I know who they are, where they're from, where they were born, and this allowed me to go further into the National Archives. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have had a family that went back and forth to China during the Exclusion Act, at the National Archives in San Bruno, you can find wonderful records, not only the incredible photographs of these families, but also these verbatim transcripts of their interviews as they're going back and forth, leaving and coming back into America. And this family here is the Jin family. And the Jin family is the descendants of little Xing Yi. That's the young woman who befriends Ying as they're coming over from China on that boat in the Also, in the National Archives, we could see why that family was allowed to go back and forth, because they were a merchant family. They owned the Chi Sang Tong at 710 DuPont Street. This was, as you can see, was a Chinese herb store. In the records of the National Archives, we could not only see the name, but we could also see discussion and photographs of all of the owners and how much they had invested. Now, probably 10 or 15 years later, on eBay, I found that photograph here. And what that is a postcard which was labeled Chi Sang Tong, 710 DuPont Street before the earthquake. And so, oh, this is gold. These are the relatives. And then if I went back and I said, you know, those faces look familiar. I went back into my photographic records and I said, well, wait, I have the National Archive photographs of the very same men. They're lined up there for you. And Jin Lun Yum, the man on the right with the scale, is the brother of the man who married little Xing Yi, the little girl on the boat. So it's an example of how turning over stones and being perseverant may allow you to make connections and solve mysteries. When I was at the National Archives, I did discover that, number one, this family did not go back and forth to China. They didn't have the money. They decided to stay here. They didn't return to China, but they did have these interesting birth certificates. This is the birth certificate for my grandmother, Kay, who's the second from the left. Now, it was obtained in September of 1903, so it's after she was born, but it says something important. It gives us a date. So something is going on in 1903, because not only do we have a birth certificate, remember, that's the same year that was on the back of this photograph. Now, what's happening, I didn't realize for probably about a decade, because I went through my grandmother's boxes that were discarded, and in the bottom of a box that had all of her little treasures was this little book of Chinese. I don't read Chinese, so I said, well, there's only one person who could have written this. It had to have been my grandfather. So I gave this to Phil Choi, and wonderful Phil gave this to his friend who translated it. He said, Russell, this is a diary. It's a list of names and dates. And the very first entry in the back of the book says, Kay, that's my grandmother, was born and raised in San Francisco in 1903. At the time of the writing, they arrived in Salem on September 16th, 1903. So what this is telling us is that that photograph in September of 1903 is the very date that she was married. This is the day when a Ying is giving her daughter, Kay, my grandmother, to Lo Sun Fook to be married. And decades later, when my sister asked my grandmother how she could marry someone so much older, she said, well, he was well off. And because I was married, they were able to feed my sister. So that's the importance of this date. But we didn't figure this out until we looked at that little Chinese book of characters. In the National Archives, we had another light bulb turned on, and that is we found in the death index the date of my great-grandfather's death. This is Hong Laiwo, or Hong Pei was also called, on December 8th, 1905. And once we knew when he died, we could then find my great-grandfather's death certificate. The importance was that it gave the cause of death. So this gives us a reason he died. He died from beriberi, which simply is a vitamin deficiency. You get this by eating polished rice, which meant that this family was essentially starving to death, and it really correlates with my grandmother's tale as well. They didn't have enough food to eat. They were dying. And that really tells us a rather dark story of what's going on here. All of this was happening because of the historical context. And it's also important that you have a historical context when you uncover these stories, because obviously all of this was happening against the backdrop of anti-Chinese legislation. In 1875, the Page Act said that if you're a woman, you were prohibited from coming to this country, making that gender imbalance much, much worse. In 1882, as we all know, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and this continued for 61 years until it was finally repealed by FDR in 1943. All of this obviously reflected an anti-Chinese sentiment that was quite pervasive. Anti-Chinese, Chinese must go, they were the yellow peril. They were driven out of America. In some cases, there were murders, and certainly businesses were burned down, as you learned about in the Tale of Three Coins. Now, because of this, the Chinese were leaving in droves. The number in San Francisco plummeted from 25,000 to less than 8,000. But they weren't just leaving, they're also taking their jobs, closing their businesses. Food and money became quite scarce. Now, in spite of this, they were taking these really incredible photographs, like this one here, sending them home to the families, perhaps trying to convince them that their lives were better off than they really were. I wanted to learn more about my great-grandmother. At this point, all we know is that she's in the picture. Her name was Ying. We found her death certificate. I know she died in 1921 from colon cancer, but what's her story? What was this little girl doing there? It turns out that as I began to search for the stories, I suspected that our family oral history probably was made up, that it wasn't true. The family history about this little Ying was that she was brought to America by nice missionary women who brought her here on a boat. They held her hand, they tucked her into bed at night, but that didn't really seem too plausible. So I asked everybody, and the only person who had a different story was Kim's daughter-in-law. And Carol told me that, well, I think Kim may have once mentioned that his mother stayed at the Cameron house. And I said, that's it. I bet that's true. So I went to the Cameron house with that one clue, and I met with wonderful Doreen Dear McLeod. And Doreen sat with me on that second floor window there looking towards us, and she handed me the book. And in that book were the handwritten names of all of these young women. This is not the actual logbook. I'll show you to that in a second. But these wonderful entries talked about who these women were, where they came from, what their disposition was, what their condition was, and what finally happened to them. It was a wonderful handwritten record by Margaret Culbertson for the early entries. We looked for about 20, 30 minutes for Tom Ying or Ying, and she wasn't there. This was devastating. It was a dead end. I said, this can't be. She had to have been here. But, I took that at face value, and I went on and did other research. But as I was preparing this talk, I realized that I did something that I want to share with you. I took notes. I went home, I took notes, I wrote everything that Doreen had told me, and these notes are really quite remarkable, and they tell a different story in and of themselves now all these years later. So that's my next tip. Take notes on everything you do and save them. When Uncle Kim and then Carol died, we went through all of his boxes. He didn't actually have an attic, but I call it Kim's attic. But we found these wonderful treasures. There were videotapes from 1984 to 1994 where his son was asking his dad to talk about his past and his genealogy. Uncle Kim then made a Hong genealogy presentation. I'll share some of that with you. And he also had a series of videotape banquet lectures where he had hundreds of guests coming for his birthday. He's talking, he's actually lecturing. No one is listening. Absolutely no one's listening, but I'm listening. And 15, 20 years later, and I'm taking notes on everything he said. He actually had all these old photographs from 1913 to 1920. And most importantly, he had a series of letters from the ancestral villages writing back to China in 1978, asking about the family history. He created this Hong genealogical sequence and also this wonderful record here he made showing the names of the family. This is Tom Shi, or Ying in Chinese. He said he's from Boxer Village. Here's her husband, my great-grandfather, Hung Lai Wo, and his name in Chinese and the name of the village. So we have some important documents there. This is the Hong genealogy tape that he made. Oops.
When you get to be my age, you often wonder. But when you get to be close to 94, you either become to philosophize or nostalgically you think back for the years that have passed. I hold in front of me a Chinese proverb which is Yam Sui Si Yun, which means by drinking water you must think of its source.
He goes on for probably about an hour and talking about lots of different things. The Hong genealogy, it's a real treasure, and I owe a lot of what I know about the Hong family to certainly wonderful Uncle Kim. One of the things that it's important to do is transcribe every single videotape. It seems arduous, but it's important because you're going to see things when you write them out that you're not going to hear. There's details in there that are so rich and wonderful to record and to realize. So I began to look for the stories behind this 1903 photograph. What were they doing there? Why were they here? And I wanted to connect to the ancestral village. This is the village of Dai Long, where the railroad worker, the great-grandfather, was from. I have these letters that are written back and forth. The only letter from China that was in English was the very first one. It was written August 30, 1978. After that, every single letter is in Chinese, and my cousin Lisa and I had these translated. Some of them were useful, some were not, but they told a wonderful story about this communication that was going on between Uncle Kim and the ancestral village and the relatives in 1978, 1979. Now, I wanted to connect with that village, so I took that first letter and I wrote a letter to that same address to this uncle. This is now 25 years later, a quarter of a century later. I'm describing who I am, my relationship to Uncle Kim, and what I'd like to know about the ancestors. Well, my great friend here, Celia Tan, got on the back of that motorcycle with my letter in hand, and she rode through the countryside trying to find Dai Long Village. Everyone who's gone to this village has gotten lost. And she told me, Russell, it was scary. They did not want to talk to me. They were very suspicious. They didn't know who she was or what she wanted. However, later they put her in contact with a family that had since moved away to Hoi Ping, and that communication allowed me to then connect to one of their sons. This is their son Guang Ming, who is my cousin, and we met in Philadelphia, and of all the things I brought him, this was the one that he most treasured. And it's a picture of his family, probably in the 1970s, and it's not one that he had brought with him to America. He's the tall young man there standing in the back. At that time, he gave me these wonderful photographs of the ancestral Hong village, ancestral home in Dai Long. This is the inside of the home, which I subsequently visited in 2016. He showed me the burial mounds where they're paying respects to the ancestors here. He made me the family tree in Chinese, and it was my friend Celia Tan who took the Chinese Hong family poem. She wrote it for me in Chinese, and she also translated it for me as well. Now, my great-grandfather, as you know, was Hung Lai Wo, and he was born in 1850 in Dai Long Village. Father was Long Yin, mother Hom Shi, and they had those 5 sons. And as we now know, Lai Wo and his older brother Jik Wo, came from this village of Dai Long in the 1860s to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad was a connection that my family didn't really immediately know. However, in September of 2003, I was up at the summit, and I knew about the connection really because of this videotape from from Uncle Kim's 100th birthday party. This man's 100 years old. My sister walks up to him with her video camera running, and she says, "Uncle Kim, tell me about your father." Well, his unrehearsed videotape reply is quite remarkable. He goes on for a little bit longer. He talks about how the uncle lost an eye in a blasting accident, but that remarkable videotape is as close as we're going to come to a railroad worker talking about his experience. It's a son describing his father's and his uncle's participation in the great Transcontinental Railroad. My dad also has some stories about his grandfather, Lai Wo, on that railroad. Now, in 2003, was up at the summit. I went into the tunnel, which you can go into if you go around some barriers, and you could touch the walls. And as I touched these blackened walls from the trains which had passed through, I could feel the spirit and the presence, really, of not just Lai Wo and Jik Wo, my ancestors, but also of the 16,000 Chinese workers who worked on this great summit tunnel and the Transcontinental Railroad. It was a remarkable journey. On the way back, I stopped at the California State Railroad Museum, and a bit later, I met the woman here on the upper right. That's Rebecca Carruthers. Remember that name. Rebecca Carruthers is one of the most remarkable people who helped to preserve the Chinese names and faces. It was Rebecca who drove this project forward with Phil Choi and said that this exhibit, this new exhibit in the California State Railroad Museum, has to have a name and a face. These Chinese road workers could no longer be nameless. Well, she took that videotape that I just showed you, and she showed it to Phil, and Phil said, "That's the name, and that's the family." So they actually became the name and the face, and they still are in that museum. These are my parents who are looking at the exhibit that they opened there in 2005, and my mom sees something. This actually captured this moment. She is looking at the payroll sheet, and you can see on the right at the bottom, she sees the name Hung Wo, and she realizes that's the name of my dad's grandfather. And this is the record of the Central Pacific Railroad from 1964, I believe. This was the opening of their new exhibit. You can see that that photograph was there at that point. And at this moment, Rebecca, because of Rebecca, the Chinese had a name and a face finally, and they have now a new exhibit which you should visit, which has many, many additional names and faces of the Chinese. Now, we have to fast forward probably 12 years. 12 years. I'm continuing to go to work every day, and finally, on June 8, 2015, there's a eureka moment, because on this day, I'm typing in the name of my great-grandfather, Hung Lai Wo, into newspapers.com, and I was astounded when this came up. It's an article which says, from the newspapers, May 9th, 1889, that Hung Lai Wall, my great-grandfather, was a villainous-looking Chinese who's after the girl. He's making a writ of habeas corpus for a Ying who is being held at the Presbyterian Mission Home. I said, what is this? What is this story? So I began to look around, and I found a whole series of additional articles that talk about this wonderful drama and romance that was playing out in the newspapers in 1889 in San Francisco. They were famous for about 2 weeks, but they didn't even know it. So this becomes the very first part of Three Coins, and it shows you the importance of the newspapers in tracking down these stories. Now, with that, I was able to then go back to the Cameron House by email, and I asked Doreen if she could go back into that logbook which we had searched in 2002. And she went back, and over a series of probably 2 or 3 weeks, she finally on July 12th said, Russell, I found it. I found the story. It's exactly the same story they have in the newspapers, but your great-grandmother changed her name. She wasn't a Ying, she was a Gu. And I'm certain that she changed her name really to protect herself, because she really didn't at that point know who to believe or who to trust. She was initially Sun Choi. A lot of these young women were given different names to sort of dehumanize them by their captors, their owners. She took the alias Agu, as you can see, but it told a wonderful story of who she was, who rescued her, when she was rescued, where she was held, and then what happened subsequently, her elopement, her running away, her return, and eventually her trial. It's all in the Cameron House records in the handwriting of Margaret Culbertson. I connected again with wonderful Doreen in 2019 when I was giving a presentation about Three Coins. It was something of a homecoming. And at that time, I met with Daniel here, and Daniel said he wanted to show me the archives of all these records. And it was a bit of a joke because that little yellow sticky says archive room, and inside this little storeroom were all of these boxes. And each of these boxes has historical records that are organized by dates, 1940 to 1950. And I said, well, Daniel, I'd like to see that logbook, that register of inmates that I was shown in 2002. And he said, well, Russ, I don't know where it is. And I said, wait, that belongs in a museum. We don't know where it is. And he said, well, wait a second. I think it might be at the bottom of the drawer here. And sure enough, in the bottom drawer of the file cabinet, he pulled it out, and we opened it up, and that's what it was. And it says, Register of Chinese Women's Home, 933 Sacramento Street, September 17th, 1874. This is the very book which I had handled, 12 years earlier. Now, it's important to realize you can't touch this anymore. It's falling apart. But what they have done is they have taken this wonderful book and they have copied it. So you can now go through the spiral ring binder and look at all of the same names and entries and not put that book at risk. Now, even more importantly, Daniel showed me this digitized database. I believe it's Excel, which they have now entered all that information. So you can search for the name of an ancestor. I asked them how many Yings there were, and I think there were like 38 different Yings. So it's much easier to find information now than it was in 2015. I wanted to return to the ancestor villages, and I did this in May of 2016. And if you want to do this, you can contact the Office of Overseas Chinese Affairs. I went to the Guangzhou office with Vivian Shen, and they need 2 pieces of information. They need the Chinese characters for the village and the ancestor. And I had both of those from different objects. I had it from from this letter, for the Hong village, and then for the Low village, I had it from my grandfather's burial stone here. This is in Dai Long village. It's 2016, and this is a wonderful photograph because it shows the village elder, Uncle Hong, grasping my hand, shaking it up and down, and talking to me in Chinese, but you don't understand. When I asked Vivian, I said, what is he saying? She said, he just told you that you're the first descendant to ever return to the village. And I think that speaks volumes about the effects of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and even more generically about the effects of separation of families. In this case, we're separated not just by an ocean, but by generations and decades. We also visited the Low village, Ha Chun Chong village, and to make a long story short, my dad and I, who are on the top there, have been told our whole lives that we don't look Chinese. Even the people in China said, "You're not Chinese. You can't be Chinese." But in this village, every single face looked like me and looked like my dad. And the reason that is, interestingly, is that this village is right on the water. This is the home that my grandfather, Lo Sun Fook, they also called him Hop Lee, left in 1877. And this is the proximity. It's right on the water. So these people in that village have been going off and exploring the world for 1,000 years, perhaps. And they had been going off not only exploring, but they'd also been marrying. They've been bringing home wives and children and DNA. And that genetic material really makes me who I am. This is its location there on the bottom, right on the coast of Toishan. When my nephews went there, they also gave them the Jiapu, which allows us now to track this back many, many, many additional generations. It's important that as you accumulate all these names and dates and the family tree, that you also establish a historical context. So you know who these people were, but also why they were and where they were. What was the story of their lives? And to do this for a Ying, certainly, I needed to understand what Chinatown was like in San Francisco in the 1880s. I found this wonderful map of Chinatown in 1885 showing you the businesses. I also found this Wells Fargo expressed a listing of all the Chinese businesses, their names in English and Chinese, and their location, so I could see where all the businesses were, and I could make this accurate historically. A more modern resource is this wonderful book written by Phil Choi, where he talks about these old buildings in terms of their architecture and also their history. Now, a really good tool if you want to learn about these places is simply look at Google Maps. I wanted to understand how far and how long did it take a Ying to travel from where she was being held captive at 611 Jackson Street to her new home at the Presbyterian Mission Home at 933 Sacramento Street. So I plotted it out. Half a mile. It took her 11 minutes to walk. She obviously went in a carriage, which was even shorter. But as I say in the book, this was a journey to another world and another life for little Ying. Looking at the photographs of old San Francisco was really also a wonderful reference for me. Many different photographs. I began with Arnold Ganth, where I'm absolutely certain he's taking pictures of this family in the 1890s and early 1900s. Another very famous photographer on the right, he's showing what DuPont Street, now Grant Street, looked like in the 1890s. And he took this photograph of the landing docks in San Francisco, the very year, 1880, that little Ying got off that boat and entered her world as a Wuxai. He also took this picture here in front of the Chinese Presbyterian Church on Sacramento Street, which becomes a wonderful chapter in the book. There are some colorized postcards. These are by a German photographer named Charles Widener, and this is of the Chinese primary school when Kim and his friend were there. And I also wanted to show you what you can do with just a little bit of touching up, simply using some basic Photoshop elements. This colorized photograph is really remarkable. It's of the women inside the Presbyterian Mission Home. And it shows their chores and their lives and their faces of these women. The very last chapter of the book, as you know, is a Ying having to escape with Xingyi and their children as they're trying to avoid certain death and possible destruction of Chinatown in San Francisco by the great earthquake. There are also some artists, some painters that were in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1800s. One of these was Charles Frederick Blum, and these two different paintings, he's showing Chinatown during Chinese New Year's, which is a different one of the chapters in the book. Now, when I visited San Francisco Chinatown, I wanted to take pictures of the same locations, and I was really quite struck how when you juxtapose these different locations, in this case 611 Jackson Street, where she's being held captive as a child slave, and look at the old photograph and the new photograph, the buildings look identical. And that's because no one wanted her to give an inch. So they knew exactly where the building belonged and how tall it was, and they rebuilt it really to look exactly like it was before the earthquake. Now, 711 Commercial Street was important because all of her children were born there, and the structure also looks quite similar to a newspaper graphic representation, I believe in about 1890s. Now, as I was doing all this research, and you'll still find on my computer a folder for each of these different subjects. And inside each of these folders, you're going to find hundreds of different articles, which become wonderful reference material. A lot of these are newspaper articles, different photographs and records, which I went back and forth as I'm trying to understand their world and trying to write about it later. For me, I had to learn about all of the Chinese customs, New Year's, weddings, childbirth, the sitting month, the red egg celebration. I didn't grow up with these, so I learned about them online, but nowadays you can simply look at Rosemary Gong's wonderful book, The Good Luck Life, to learn about all of these really important celebrations and customs. Once you have all this information, you have to find the story. And the stories for initially were easy because it was obviously a Ying and Lai Wal's dramatic story of their love and their romance, but I needed to find additional stories. And I did this by really looking back through my records. And one of the stories I found was really offered to me by my sister Laurel. She said that our Popo, Kay, had told her that her feet were bound for a brief time. They weren't bound for long, but just long enough. And so I wanted to include that in a chapter, so I needed to learn about foot binding, and you can read about that in Wikipedia, but I found a much better resource was to look at newspapers.com. And here on May 13th, 1894, I found a wonderful article about Mui Jung, the foot binder. Talks about what she did, how much she charged, what the ceremony was, and detailed descriptions of how she wrapped these feet. So I was on the scene in 1894 as this was going on. Another important chapter is an unpaid debt, murder in Chinatown. Now, Jinlun Qi was the herbalist. He married Xing Yi, the little girl who befriends Zhao Ying on the boat. And family lore was that he was murdered in front of his drugstore in 1896. And indeed, it's true because I found all these articles that talk about that. So we could recreate this in terms of the details of that murder and the trial. And then a wonderful Carol shared with me this picture of Jinlun Qi, and it's really a remarkable story because it brings the story to life through this photograph. You're going to make personal connections as you go on these journeys, and one of the very first connections I made was to a man named Greg Kim. Greg's a wonderful resource. At the time, I didn't know he was a priest. All we knew was that we were the first people either of us had ever met who were direct descendants of one of these rescued women. We were the great-grandsons of some of Margaret Culbertson's girls. And that was enough of a connection. But there was an additional connection which I didn't know, because I sent him this photograph. And I knew what the photograph was because it was labeled from the Oakland Museum. And Greg then told me, he said, Russ, you know, we've had that photograph in our family for 140 years, but we didn't know what it was. And he didn't know what it was because he had an original that wasn't labeled. The final connection between Greg and this story and that picture was that he's standing next to the woman on his right is my dear Aunt Grace, who's 104 years old now, and she still has this wonderful email train. And the sixth name in her email train was Greg Kim. When I asked Aunt Grace how she knew Greg Kim, she said, well, he's my priest. So our families are connected in the 1880s. They're connected through Greg in this picture, and now also through Aunt Grace. On this wonderful genealogy journey, I was able to trace the lives, the stories of little Ying across decades. She goes from a 9-year-old in 1880 to a mother, and finally a grandmother there in 1916. It was an incredible journey. Once you have all this, you need to preserve all those stories and photographs, and don't depend upon hard drives. Digital copies are going to disappear. Your notes will disappear. Cloud passwords are going to be lost. You're going to die someday, and no one will know how to access this. So what I'm encouraging you to do is write something down. Write it in book, because paper will last a long time. Digital media will not necessarily. The timeline for 3 Coins, it shows that I started writing in 2015 in July. The first half of the book was written in just 4 months. The second half took me an additional 18 months to find those additional stories about the murder and foot binding and so on. I added one final chapter in September 2018 and finally published it in April of 2019, almost exactly 4 years to the day of when I began this journey. So it takes a while, but it's a wonderful record of what you can achieve. My final tip to you is keep searching, because you never know what the next stone may uncover as you lift it up. Long after I published the book, I found this photograph by Arnold Gant that I am absolutely certain that this photograph is showing Kay, Bing, and Kim Hong on the streets of San Francisco in the mid-1880s. I want to thank you for being there and reading the book and sharing with me the wonderful stories, not only of Three Coins, but of how Three Coins has connected you perhaps to your own families. I know many of you have read this. Anyone who wants to contact me can use this email address, rlow52@yahoo.com, and I'd be happy to talk to you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I really am looking forward to talking to all of you.
Thank you so much, Russell. That was an incredible journey you took in order to have your family stories told. And so maybe people have some questions right away. And then after that, we have some questions for everybody to share, because I would like you who have read the books to share some of your reflections or your stories and what you think. So maybe there's some questions immediately because of this presentation. Anybody raise your blue hand?
Okay, I see Loretta has her hand raised. Loretta, would you like to speak?
Yes, I read your book in 3 days. I was so fascinated, and I'm so impressed with all the work you put into the research to write this novel. I mean, it just led me to think about all the pictures I've been going through and trying to figure out whether I should throw them out. And I'm kind of sorry now that I sent a bunch to my son of the Lum side of the family. And now I think I'll ask him to send back those old photos. There is some value in having them. So
yeah, those photos are remarkable, aren't they? They tell incredible stories, and I've often thought that if I could just sit down with my ancestors, with Ying or Lai Wall for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, I could learn so much more than it's taken me 3 decades to learn. But Loretta, the wonderful thing about the Three Coins is that it opens our eyes and our hearts to all of these stories that are in our families. And it may be Ying's story, but it's yours as well. There's someone in your family just like that.
Well, I want to just thank you for the hard work you put into it. And I didn't realize how possessed a person can be with trying to find, the stories behind pictures. And
I was, as I tried to acknowledge, I was helped by so many people. And I think that all of those people hopefully hear the message of appreciation that comes from me, because they really open the door, and to not just to tell me the stories, but share with me all those wonderful photographs.
But I want to add that, I kept reading like for 3 days. I just couldn't put it down. Yeah, really.
That's wonderful.
It was like, how did this man, write what people may have said? I mean, of course, you probably didn't know what they said, but you put into words, it sounded so real and everything. So you're a master of, the conversations.
I think that, I initially felt a little self-conscious that there was too much dialogue. But as I read it now, I said, no, this is right. This is the people speaking. And I really wanted it to be their story, to let them tell their own story.
Yeah.
Exactly right. I think dialogues are very effective. So you feel about the characters directly connected to it. So, any other questions? If not, I'm going to ask some questions for you.
It seems Stephen Chan, would you like to speak?
Yeah, this is his wife, Laura. Your cousin, we know a Candace Tom, but from high school.
Whoa.
What is she?
Are you related to Candace?
No, not just. Did she go to Oakland High? Did she go? Yeah, did she go to Oakland High?
No. I grew up in Stockton, and my cousin Candace, as you saw, was part of the story as well. But her family now lives. She passed away, but her family is her husband, at least, is in San Francisco.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sort of an unusual name.
You are connected to the story in remarkable ways, so just share with them why you know about this story.
I was wondering, was she sold because she was a girl, or was she sold because the family had no food to feed her? I was just curious. You any idea?
I'd like to go back and ask them.
Yeah, because
I really want to go back to her village, which is Buxar. I think I know where it is, or at least the general area. But for trying to trace women back is much more challenging because they aren't included in the family tree. A lot of these young women were sold because of poverty, basically. And if you haven't heard the formal presentation of the book I do, I'll encourage you to contact me so I can hook you up with one of those. But she was sold by her family for, I think it was $80, 1880, and it was because they were poor. They were starving, and unfortunately, the truth is, young women weren't valued. They weren't valued in China, and they weren't valued here, and that's what led to human trafficking. This is a story about human trafficking, quite frankly. It's a story of resilience, but it's a story of what happens to these young women, and it's a problem that continues today. And I think that many of the people involved in human trafficking today, right here in San Diego, are very taken with this story because it's a story of hope. It shows that when you can rescue one woman, you will rescue generations of future Americans. And I think it's a model to follow, perhaps. Laura, are you still there? I recently met Steve Chen. He's read the book, and he told me that his wife, Laura, grew up on Commercial Street, and she grew up right next to the building where Ying had her 5 children. It's a remarkable connection. She was there, maybe 80 years later, but it's the same street. She walked up and down the very same streets that little Ying went up and down. It's incredible. And these are just sort of coincidences that come out of the woodwork. It's really quite remarkable. Because of this story, I've met many women, are descendants of these women, who now come forward, women and men who say, my great-grandmother also stayed at that rescue home. And it's because of this story, it's like they're given permission to connect and talk about it, and talk about it with pride. Because as I often say, these young women were incredibly bold. They were resilient. You can't say that word enough. They became the foundation of early Chinese American society, and we should celebrate their stories, because without them, many of us wouldn't be here.
And the sad part with us is our parents, we don't have much oral history, but my grandfather, my father's father, was already in San Francisco. So he might have been around at that time. I don't know. And then my father, I don't know when he came, but he got, went back home to get married. And my mom came in 47 to that Commercial Street address, I presume.
No, it just gives me chills when I think that you grew up on the same street. Laura actually walked up and down those streets of Chinatown as I was doing the research. I was trying to figure out which way to turn, which way she would walk, whether it was uphill or downhill. So I walked right by the street where you grew up. That's amazing.
Yeah. That's great. I guess I want to ask people, is there any section of the book you feel you can relate to it, to your own life? And so that's part of the question, reflection. I want to say something. The book, there's one place talk about Chinese picnic. I had a direct experience of that because I'm a first generation immigrant. I came in 1976. I went to graduate school and I had a scholarship in Cleveland. So it's similar to anyone coming to the United States when you don't know anybody. I was picked up at the airport by someone from the Chinese school student association. So someone picked me up. I didn't know her, but we communicated through school. So someone picked me up and she introduced me to this Chinese picnic. So it was first time I went to a picnic, and it was arranged by a Chinese church. So I think it's a similar stories continue. The new people who come, you get associated with the Chinese church, and then you get integrated in the society. So I thought that was very interesting. Chinese picnic. It was from 100 years ago. People were doing that. No, that was always the case. Anyway, so I just wonder if other people want to talk about their own experience, that when you read this book and then you made you think about something, your own experience. Anybody wants to share with us? or you just want to ask more questions from Russell?
Yeah, I'm happy. This is your opportunity to learn about it.
Yes.
I hope it inspires you to explore more of your own story and to record it, because all these stories are out there. The other remarkable thing I found that as I was doing this is that all of these families knew each other. There were connections to the families that only now we can uncover a little bit about. But if you were someone who had families in San Francisco, Chinatown before the earthquake, and they had children in particular, they all knew each other and they interacted. They had family life together, perhaps.
If I may, I can see that there's been a little bit of dialogue in the chat box. So I can see, for example, pretty soon after the presentation, Justine Wong had a comment. She wanted to say, thank you, Russ, for sharing your journey and discovery of the discovery and research behind the writing of Three Coins. I also see, I think it may be Elaine Pierce. Her name is SDMA Docent Elaine, who commented, what an outstanding research effort and fascinating story that resulted. Thank you. I also see that Jean Andrews mentions the Chinese American experience is unexplored in American history. This book is a wonderful way to share this enriching history, and that she also loved the dialogue.
Jean is also an author, actually. I met her online. She has a remarkable story of her own and quite proficient and knowledgeable about Chinese history.
Finally, I see Cindy Yi. She mentions that her god-grandmother had the same experience as Dr. Lo, as your great-grandmother. Her family sold her and hoped that she would have a better future, and that she was raised in the Cameron home in the early 1900s.
There are a lot of these interesting connections that come forward. I've met Cindy early on in this experience. She's quite a whirlwind as well. She hooked me up with lots of things, but that connection to the Cameron house is quite visceral, is quite real. And these women who gave birth to generations of Americans got their beginnings in that home. The second novel that's about to come out, or at least I've hooked up with a publisher, is called The All-American Journey. And it is basically sort of skips forward a couple of generations, and it connects to the Cameron house again. Because what happened in World War II is that these grandsons, or in some cases sons of the rescued women, were sent back on a pilgrimage to the Cameron house. So they're in their uniform, they're going overseas, and they're sent back with gifts to Donaldina Cameron to pay their respects to the woman and the institution that gave their family's life. And my uncle Stanley goes. Stanley is Ying's grandson, and he's going back there. He meets another young man as well who also was rescued. And it really is a remarkable first chapter because it talks not only about who they are, these young men dressed up in uniform, but about who their grandmothers were. And she opens the logbook and she shows them the entries and the stories of their grandmothers, and it really connects them to their past, as I'm connecting you to your past as well. And then the All-American Crew then follows Stanley's story further into World War II, and eventually what happens to him and his B-24 Liberator crew. You know, it's a story about young men. It recreates their lives. Not to plug it too much, but it's a story that nobody knew. It's a story basically that we didn't know because Stan did not come home from the war. He died. He was 20 years old, and he gave his life for our country. His B-24 Liberator and a crew of 10 men disappeared on January 22nd, 1943. Not a trace. No one heard about them. And 80 years later, I tried to make contact with some of the families, and surprisingly, a lot through Ancestry.com, I was able to find people in these families, and it was an outpouring of love for these men and of wanting to have closure. So they sent me these photographs and these letters that were sent home by these young boys, and we brought them back to life. So they are now living on the pages of this book, and it's a remarkable and rather emotional tribute to these young men who were basically, in Stanley's case, here because of his connection to the Cameron house. So I hope you'll get a chance to, I'll get a chance to share with you in a bit later.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe I'm going to ask another question, see if people will join. Did you learn something from this book that you didn't know before? I'm sure everybody learned something you didn't know before. So would you guys share What did you learn that you didn't know before?
Can I don't know how to.
That's okay.
Okay, all right. Well, you know, I've written to Russell. I think I wrote you a note about this after I got a copy of your book, and I learned so much about Chinese American history. I mean, I'm a typical American that lives in the South, raised in the East, and you know, we know about Chinese food, and we know. I mean, I've had Chinese students. I was a professor of deaf education, but you really added really an enriching part on the struggle, not only the discrimination at the railroad with the men, but the way the women were treated in child prostitution and domestic service. I mean, it was those kinds of things don't come up a lot in American history books. When we get the laws and we realize that the laws were discriminatory, but I think you really, you know, put really the human face on the Chinese American experience.
I think it's important, at least the way I see it, and I think you as well, is that to teach history through the voices and the lives of the people who created it is something that we'll all remember. I mean, you'll never forget Ying and the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Geary Act, because you have stories now that were real, that can be recreated and remembered. And one of the best reviews of the book that I have is someone said, well, that's the way we should teach history, you know, through the lives of people.
Yeah,
I agree with that, yes.
Anyone else wants to say something?
I wanted to know what is the background of the term highbinders?
I don't know, to be actually. A highbinder is basically one of the Tong thugs. Basically, they were the hitmen, and I don't know where it came from. I suspect some of this was created in the newspapers. There were some cases where a lot of this blood and gore and that was going on in Chinatown was dramatized to sell newspaper print, basically. And I think, however, that it was real. And I know that we all have experiences, stories that were told to us by parents and grandparents about the Tongs and the Tong Wars, but that's where it came from.
Thank you.
So Chinese probably had their own phrase for that. I don't know what
they did.
Yeah, but I don't know what it's called. So now we just know highbinders. Yeah.
We need the other Lily here to help us.
So, you know, you guys read the book, so I would like you to share your experience. Anybody want to talk about what do you really like about the book? I know we all love the book. Can you tell us what you like about? Anybody?
Well, if I could talk.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
I think Russell, I think you presented a very balanced picture of lots of issues, you know, like religion. Religion has done really good things in my field, deaf education, but it also has been very oppressive and negative things. And I thought the way that you presented the Presbyterian house, that it saved the girls, but at the same time, they were a little rigid on making sure, wanting the girls to conform to their beliefs. And I thought that really came out. And also the parents, I mean, I felt empathy for the parents that sold their daughter, you know, their hunger. And I thought that you presented that well too. So I think it's hard to, when you don't present a balanced picture, something comes across as being very sentimental and not, you know, authentic. But I really felt the authentic writing in the book with the different issues.
Thank you. I think that one of the challenges for me and my real desire was to understand what it was like for her mother to sell her daughter.
Yeah.
That must have been absolutely horrendous. And I didn't have any, obviously, firsthand knowledge, but I started reading and I found an author, Xin Ran, I believe her name is, and she was initially a radio talk show host. And ultimately, this is maybe in the 90s or 2000s she was doing this, where she was having a talk show where she was asking women to call in and to talk about their experiences selling their daughters or aborting their children or killing their daughters. And she had this outpouring of tremendous grief and emotion and sadness from these women that they carried for the rest of their lives. And from that, I was able to sort of have a glimmer of an understanding of what it was like, because to me, that's what I needed to know, What was it like for the mother?
Loretta, I guess Loretta raised her hand again.
I want to say that I was very impressed with Ying having friends who actually aided and abetted her in her escape and, you know, her secret meetings with her eventual husband, but how loyal they were to her, and that she must have had a real leadership role in, you know, their circle, her circles.
I think it's one of the things that sort of just happened and evolved over the book was her growth. You know, she starts as a young girl, a 9-year-old girl, waking up in her bedroom in China, seeing the play of the leaves and the reflections, and going off to see her father and the boat race, and then being basically a helpless young girl on that boat, alone and afraid at 9. But even then, she's defiant. She doesn't really want to give in. But then she progresses to becoming a muisai, and then wanting to escape, and wanting to eventually becoming a mother and a grandmother, joining the revolution, and ultimately escaping with her children and saving their lives. And it really is sort of an evolution of her growth. And I think I didn't intend for that, but this story sort of took her in that direction. I often think that,
can you say a little bit about the Billy character in the book? Was that real, or was that something that helped the story along?
Billy is oral history, family history. Billy has to be real. You know, I've asked people, do you want Billy to be real? And they said, oh yes, so Billy's real. And you know, a lot of things you can't know what they said, but she had help. She didn't do this by herself. And I think that is one of the important things to understand. And there were connections between the Chinese world and the white world, and Billy represents that. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, that she did have help. The judge helped her, obviously. He set her free. It was that interesting scene in the courthouse where there's this tug of war between the missionaries and Ying and Lai Wall wanting to escape, and Billy there, and then the Tong Highbinders in the back of the room wanting to re-enslave her. You know, that's this dynamic struggle that was going on, and that one, her fate really hung in the balance of that one decision.
But I think sometimes life is mysterious, that when you are really at a kind of dead end, something happens and help you. So never lose the hope. I think that's really what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, but Ying, as a mother and grandmother, whispers that to her children every night: never ever give up hope. And as you learn about in the subsequent book, The All-American Story, Stan's brother tells him that. He basically teaches the same message to his younger kid brother, to never give up hope, never stop fighting. And he has no idea where it came from, but he knows that it's the spirit that's part of his family, and it came from Ying. So it's the ripples that continue on across generations and decades. And it's the theme of the strength of the characters. One of the things that's important to realize that it's a book about a young Chinese girl in Chinese history, but it's not just a Chinese story. There are stories like this in every single ethnic group. It's an American story. You know, how we came to be in this country is one of struggle and sacrifice and triumph. And I think it's a story to be celebrated really by all of us, particularly at a time like this.
Yeah, it's a human story, especially American story, yes.
I mean, you're all part of the story. You know, Lily, you're part of the story. And this story plays out over and over and over. And hopefully it'll have a positive outcome for all of us.
Yes. Any other comments? I guess my questions are not good enough. I'm not getting.
I can see 2 hands raised via video. I think, is it Laura and Steve? Would you like to speak?
Oh, her dog's barking. I had a question about, you know, the name changing, or second name, that when they got married or something was a paper name and you know, their real name. That was confusing. Was that hard to research, to connect the people who they really were?
That changing of Ying's name when she went from Sun Choi. Sun Choi is actually interesting because that's a name that was given to her by her owners. And they did that to dehumanize her, to take away her identity. So she was no longer who she was. She was now their property, and she was Sun Choi. And I say that with some anger because it's
about,
true. You know,
like,
they did this all the
her
time.
husband.
But her real name was Tom, was her family name, but it was Gu Ying. And she had, as many of the Chinese did, and perhaps still do, she had three names: Tom, family name, and Gu Ying. But she was a Ying to the people who knew her. However, when she presented to the Cameron House, or the Presbyterian Mission Home, she didn't trust them. She wasn't sure. After 6 years of abuse, she said, well, I may have to leave this place, so let me give them the other name. I'll be a Gu. So she was a Gu, and because she changed her name, or they gave her that, quote, pseudo-alias, I couldn't find her for 13 years. And it wasn't until the newspaper articles were discovered that then Doreen Dare McLeod went back and said, it's the same person. I only find one family reference in an immigration interview where they refer to a Ying as a Gu. Only one. Every other time she's a Ying. So it is one of her names, one of her three names. So it wasn't one she used very often.
Well, I think when you add the in front of a name, it's sort of like common.
Yeah, it's just like
is very common. Almost everybody.
Is the awesome. Third character, right? The Ying is the third character of your Chinese name. I mean, first your surname and then the middle name, and
that's right.
It's typical. Yeah, typical. There are two characters in your given name, and your first name, two characters for given name, and it's common that something people use the third character, something. It's very common, especially for children. Yeah. Everybody's something.
The other confusing part of the story, as I did the research, was as I looked at the newspaper articles from 1889, there were two parallel stories that told the same story but had totally different names. And I couldn't understand that. Were there two different women who were kidnapped at the same time? And then from a laundry, and I said, what's going on here? And finally I realized it was just the bonehead reporters totally messing up the Chinese names.
Oh, yeah.
One time he was a shoemaker, one time he's a cigar maker, one time he's Mrs. Sung and Mrs. Lung, and that they didn't know, but they just put in some names that sounded correct. But once I realized, no, it's the same story, then I could put all these articles together and see that they were talking about the same person. They really were well known. I mean, probably for 2 weeks, people were following them in the papers, but since they didn't read English, they had no idea. That was another interesting thing I had to struggle with initially, which was I knew she probably didn't speak English, but I had to write this in English. So I had to give myself permission to allow her to speak English. And as easy as that sounds now, it was a bit challenging because I wanted this to be accurate. Once I got over that, then it was fairly simple to let her speak. And much of this story basically is the sense that I allowed her to speak. When I had trouble writing, I just sort of left the computer. I went down, laid down, and I imagined the story. I sort of let her voice come through, imagine the next characters, and then it was fairly simple.
Now, the other part was more the male, when her husband had a different name on when they went to get their license or something. Because I'm pretty sure my dad had a second name, and I don't know what the tradition or why you have two names.
Yeah,
one Chinese before you married and one after, I think you said.
Chinese have multiple names, and other people may be more knowledgeable than I am, but you have sort of a childhood name. He as a childhood name, the railroad worker, was called Hong Poi. Poi was his childhood name, Hong Poi. His married name would be Hung Lai Wo. So Hong again, and then the Wa is the generation name. So all of his brothers, all of his cousins were Wa. They're all Hung Wa. He was Hung Lai Wo. But he also had a business name, and his business name was Ji Sung. And Ji Sung actually was a name we had never heard, but it's in those newspaper articles. They over and over and over call him Ji Sung. So, well, this must be accurate. So they had a business name as well. So those three names make things confusing, but it's part of how Chinese do the name.
I think in the old days, Chinese people did have multiple names. It was very common when we studied history. When we read about different historical people, they all have at least 2-3 names that we have to remember. But I think that has gone away. In modern days, people don't have multiple names, but it was really common, especially when you're a kid at home. parents will call you a name, and then what's written on the document is totally a different name. That was very common.
So Lily, do they still use the generation names?
Yes. Okay. Some people do. Yeah, some people do.
The generation name was reserved for those who were married, for the men who married. So if you didn't get married in the old days, you didn't get a generation name, didn't get a formal married name. So I guess
but there's a story about this generation name. It's a Chinese old tradition. So during the communist revolution, they wanted to get rid of this generation name. So a lot of Chinese from mainland China now have names of just a single character for their name. So it would be just family name and then one character for their name, because they were trying to get rid of this generation name. And that was part of the communist revolution. So it's kind of interesting. That plays into this cultural history.
Yeah, that is interesting. One of the things I was told recently was that in the Four Counties area, Taishan, Huiping, in that area there, that they were very, very adamant about preserving the jiapu, the family books, so they would hide them, they'd bury them, they'd send them away to other places, they put them in safekeeping. And so that nowadays, if you try to find these, most of the books you can find are from that Four Counties area. The rest of China has lost that part of their culture, their history, and who they are. It's unfortunate, but for most of us who immigrated from that area of China, you still have a pretty good chance of finding it.
Yeah, that's also all related to Cultural Revolution. They were trying to destroy some of the old things.
So my nephews, my nephews went back to the Low family village, and they presented that with them then at that time. And then they said, "When's Uncle Russell coming back? Because we want him to fix up his house."
They can add your name to the family tree.
Well, my house they wanted me to fix up was the one with the chickens in it. That was falling apart. So, an interesting thing about the family book, however, was that this grandfather, who had 10 children in Salem, Oregon, none of that family was in their book. And I didn't understand what was going on or why that was. I never quite explained it to me. So that was interesting. So that branch of the family never was included. Although they knew about him. They knew that he was the wayward son who never came home. He's still buried in Salem, Oregon.
I could see from a while back that Jean Andrews has a question. Jean, would you like to share your question?
Yes. Russell, what is the significance of 3 coins? I know, it for good luck, but is that part of Chinese culture, or is that something that you adopted, or what's the background on that?
3 coins is a story. 3 coins, so much of this goes back to Uncle Kim. We saw him speak a couple times. In one of the 1990, 84 videotapes, whenever this was, he talked about the legend of 3 coins. And he said that when I was leaving, he's 10 years old, he's leaving with Bing, and they're dressed up in their Chinese costume, just like in the 1903 photograph. And they're living on Sacramento Street, I think, and his mother hands him the 3 coins, and she tells him the legend of the 3 coins. And the legend of the 3 coins, which I'm sort of paraphrasing, was that somebody died, and their spirit inhabits the waters of this river, and anybody who wants to pass over safely now has to throw 3 coins into it so they're not pulled under the water by this spirit. So now the custom that Ying is passing on to her children was that, well, when you cross over the San Francisco Bay, leaving home to go off to Montana, I want you to take these 3 coins and throw them into the water. And that's the story that he shared with me through that videotape. And obviously Ying learned about it because her mother gave her those 3 same coins. So I thought, well, that's a cool legend. That must be true. And then I spoke to a young woman who visited me from Shanghai. And I said, well, have you ever heard of this 3 coins? And she said, oh, yeah, absolutely. We all know this story. It's one they still take part in. And then I asked her also on a side note about that saying about when drinking water, always remember its source so you don't forget its origin, that thing. He said, yeah, that's very well known. So all these things that I learned from Uncle Kim are still alive in the Chinese culture and tradition. We've sort of lost them here. So the significance, the reality, the authenticity of this book, 3 Coins, really comes a lot from what I learned from Uncle Kim through those videotapes.
Well, it was a beautiful unifying theme, beginning and the end. So it was really lovely.
And the story, Three Coins, continues in the subsequent two books, actually, because you may have noticed that when they send Stanley's belongings back, that inside of his box are the 3 coins, which he didn't throw into the water. So
that's right. I really, it kind of made a strong impression to me, that because he didn't throw in the water, so he didn't make it.
There's actually an intervening book. What happened was I was writing another book, which is sort of in between the two of them, and the end of that book was the World War II, to talk about her grandsons and what happened to them. And that story just took off. It just had a life of its own. And I contacted these people from all over the country, and they started sending me the letters and photos. I said, my God, what is this? And I had this wonderful story. So I sort of put that one aside and worked on the third one. And that's the one that's about to be published. So
we'll look forward to your new book.
Yes.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
I do. Yes.
It's different, but very similar. It's told in a very similar tone. I let the men speak, and it's not just about a war. It's about who they were as people, and about their first love and their first beer, and all these things that Stan gets to do very briefly in his life before he dies. But the story also talks about his brother, my dad, and their life on Saipan, and a little bit about after the war, because it's important to connect to the people who went on. But it's also important to remember them.
Yes. So any other questions? If not, I think we are done. It's been a pleasure.
Yes,
I've met so many of you. The wonderful benefit of 3 Coins for me is getting to meet people like all of you. It's just absolutely wonderful. It's just a story and an experience that deals about people and human emotions and connections. So as you can see, I like to speak. I like to connect to people. So if any of you, like Steve or Jean, have other groups that want to hear a story that's compelling and inspirational, send them my way. I'd love to meet more of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank everybody who participated. This has been a pleasure. It's a different from our lecture, but this is really fun. I think this is fun. So we will have other books, and I will invite other authors and to hear what they have to say. It's really great to meet the author after reading the book and meet the author. It's great.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, then I think this is it. Do we have any last minute thing?
One quick question. Shall we make the recording of this available to the public?
Yeah, that's fine with me. Absolutely.
Cool.
So,
yeah, I think especially Russell's presentation, we should definitely make that available.
Any of you who have other questions or comments, you can reach me through my email address, which I gave you, and also it's in the chat box somewhere. So good. It's great to have so many wonderful friends who like the story. You're all part of the 3 Coins family and my family now. So thank you so much. It's been a rare privilege to share this story with all of you. And I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. It's a story that connects all of us to our past and to each other. And I think at a time
Thank
like
you
this,
for writing the book.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for enlarging our universe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, cool. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, you guys did a great job. Thanks, Liz.